I remember saying in 2022 that 2024 was going to be the most consequential election of our lifetime.
Guys, we are back and we are so excited to have a very special guest with us on this week's edition of the Thinking Out Loud radio show. She has been on the podcast before, and we're so very happy to have her back with us again. But before we jump into our conversation with our very special guest, I want to give her a proper introduction. She was born and raised in Michigan, Justice that earned her Juris Doctorate at the University of Detroit School of Law and served in the Michigan Legislature from 2019 until 2023, where she was a member of the Judiciary Committee. And she served as a Michigan Supreme Court Justice since January 1st, 2023. And she is indeed the first Black woman to serve as a justice on the Michigan Supreme Court. It is my pleasure to introduce to you those who have been on this podcast before and those who are brand new to this podcast. A good friend of ours. She's been on the podcast before, but we're so happy to have her back with us. Our good friend, ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to welcome Justice Kyra Harris Bolden. Welcome to the Thinking Out Loud radio show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We are so very excited to have you back with us. And this time she is running for re-election on the Michigan Supreme Court. And we're going to talk more about her re-election bid in this week's edition of the podcast. We're, again, as I said, so very excited and honored to have a member of the Michigan Supreme Court, Justice Bolden, with us. And I can't wait to jump into this interview. And so right out the gate, Justice Bolden, you know that this is a very important election cycle coming up in less than 30 days. November 5th has been marked on many people's calendars for a very long time, including yours, I'm sure. And a lot of people are waiting to vote. Some have voted already. But I want to ask you your opinion of something that has been said since the start of this election cycle. Do you believe and do you agree that this is the most consequential election in our nation's history? It might sound like a cliche in some instances. We've heard this before, but do you believe that this particular election cycle coming up in November the 5th is the most consequential election in U.S. history?
I do. And just as you pointed out, we say that every single election, right? But every single election, it happens to be true. And I remember saying in 2022 that 2024 was going to be the most consequential election of our lifetime. But you know what? The stakes are just so high. I was in the Michigan Legislature, for example, and I know that there are a lot of people that obviously don't understand the nuances of legislating and what we do or what the governor does. And quite frankly, that's why you hire people to do that, right? But you know, what people need to know is you're hiring people for a job, but it's a job that someone is going to occupy, whether you have a say or not. People are drawing salaries and also making very important decisions about resource allocations for your community. So I will say this, there are so many people that will claim to do X, Y, and Z, right? And then if people don't see results in 1 or 2 years, then they're ready to just throw in the towel. But governing is a long-term investment. For some of my bills that got passed into law, it took me championing them for 4 years before I even got movement. There are some bills that I thought were really important and consequential that never received a hearing. But one of the first bills that was passed into law, I ended up picking up the mantle on it. And it was something that had literally been introduced every year for 10 years. I picked it up. And it was just the right time to do it, where there was a consensus of people that thought it was important. And so it takes time and it takes your diligence. So even if you don't care about the resource allocation, which the state allocates billions of dollars to different communities, and who is representing you and who's advocating for you at that table absolutely matters to how much resources your community will receive. But I will also say, again, your tax dollars are going to somebody regardless of if you participate or not. So why not have a say in who's receiving your tax dollars that is going to represent you in a particular seat? An election is a job interview, right? And I think people just have to take it as choosing the best person out of the available people, because I will say, in running for elections myself, a lot of people don't want to raise their hands because it's difficult. So many people say, I'm glad you're doing it because I could never. But it's just so important. And the last thing I'll say about this, if you are fine, if you have the luxury of not getting involved, if your life is good, think about future generations. Think about generations that you won't have the benefit of seeing or touching or hearing. The decisions that we make, even on the Michigan Supreme Court, right, they set a precedent. So every decision that I make in a case, every opinion that we issue going forward in the court has generational impacts.
Right.
And it sets a precedent, meaning that we're looking at cases from the late 1800s, early 1900s as precedent for how we should govern ourselves moving forward. And so future generations will be looking at the opinions that we write today as far as how they should govern themselves. So if your life is good and you have all the resources that you need, think about the generational impact. Think about your children and your children's children, and so on and so forth.
I think that is an excellent point you made, especially when sometimes people have, and we'll talk about this in another question, some people look at politics from a selfish standpoint, where what are they doing for me personally? What is their political agenda going to do to benefit me? And there's some merit to that, I think. We have to begin to think collectively, and as you said, generationally, for those people who are not even here yet. We're going to the ballot boxes to speak for them and to speak for their livelihood and their opportunities that may not have been even afforded yet. And that's what makes this election consequential. Another thing that I thought about, and I was talking to somebody else who mentioned this, and I'm not even sure if you're aware of it, but they said that in November, or this year actually, 50% of the world's leaders are up for re-election or up for election in countries around the world. And that adds another layer of consequence to this election in November, because the world is going to be watching the United States and what decisions that we will make and who we think will be our president or should be our president for the next 4 years. And that's another reason why this election is, in my view, consequential, and probably the most consequential in our nation's history. And so I do agree with you, Justice Bolden, that there's a lot at stake. The stakes are high. And for that reason, we should definitely take this election in November very seriously. I want to also know, what advice would you give someone who is looking at this election and looking at this political landscape and basically is checked out and said, you know what, they have become apathetic? I'm sure you've heard people say that before. They don't feel a connection with anyone that's running. They don't feel like their voice is being heard. They feel like they're at the very bottom of the ladder of connectivity to any of the candidates, and I guess even to what is happening in this political climate that we're in right now, what advice would you give to someone who's basically said they're going to sit this one out and they're not going to vote in November?
I think it's what I said before. Even if you think you're good, or even if you think you're not good, that's all the more reason to vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like there is a place for the government, whatever branch, to improve your quality of life, and that process is done by the people that represent you, then you should absolutely vote. For the people that feel like my life is good, there's everything is fine, everything is chugging along, even more reason for you to vote, because that probably means the people in power have been doing what you want them to do. And what if they lose their seat? Or there might be people that, your representative may be the single factor that's keeping something from happening. So you have to dig into that. Again, not only just for yourself, but for future generations. The money allocated today for a particular community, you probably won't see those effects until 5, 10 years down the line. And so again, bringing it back to the Michigan Supreme Court, a lot of the decisions that we make do have impacts, obviously, for the cases that are before the court. But what we do is we decide cases that have a broad implication for all Michiganders, and that will be the law of the land or the interpretation of the land until another court comes along. And these terms are usually 8 years. And so when I was running in 2022 and I was pregnant with my first child, just to put that in context, I said, if I were to win this election and serve for 2 terms, my kid would almost be eligible to vote herself.
Mm.
That is the type of consequence that we're talking about. And we're talking about decisions being made each one of those years that Michiganders have to abide by for generations to come. Why wouldn't you want to have a voice in who's making those decisions?
And I agree. You're almost cutting your nose off to spite your face in some instances when you say, I'm not going to vote because this didn't go my way, or I'm not going to vote because I don't like either of the candidates. They're not speaking to my particular situation. And another aspect of that, I think, is important, that there is a level of responsibility that citizens have as well. There's a civility and a civic mindedness that we're supposed to have when it comes to our community. We have to have a vested interest in local government. It's not just the presidential election, which has definitely garnered a lot of attention, but what do you know who your representatives are? Do you know what's going on in city government? Do you listen to or watch any of the city council meetings in your local municipality? There's an engagement that's required for you as well. A lot of that is assumed when a person decides to vote, but it's also a part of the equation when someone says they're not going to exercise their right to vote, because to me, it suggests that they don't have a concern, or they don't have a care for their community. They don't have a care for their fellow man. All they're caring about is themselves or their own self-interest. And I think that's a very selfish perspective. I that's just my opinion. I've talked to individuals who have expressed that they've checked out. They're not going to vote. But I want to ask you, Justice Bolden, what does the Michigan Supreme Court do to secure voting rights in the state of Michigan? Does your court, I know Attorney General Dana Nessel definitely prosecutes those individuals who might want to do something negatively against those who want to vote, or to try to do something to intimidate voters or what have you. But does the Michigan Supreme Court, do they also have a voice, or do they also weigh in on voting rights in the state of Michigan?
Yeah, so the Michigan Supreme Court absolutely weighs in on different election issues, different voting issues. And what's important to know is that we're the last word
Mm,
in those decisions. And
right.
so folks may remember anytime the Board of Canvassers deadlocks, right? That issue will go to the Michigan Supreme Court. This is public information, but we have gotten election cases this year, right? And so absolutely we do. And again, I think it's very important to know who's at the table making those very important decisions.
I agree. I totally agree. I know you guys are enjoying my interview with Michigan Supreme Court Justice Kyra Harris Bolden. So happy to have her back with us on this week's edition of the Thinking Out Loud radio show podcast. And I want to also talk about this because we talked in off air about voter education. We're fastly approaching early voting in the city of Detroit. I think early voting has started already in the state of Michigan. Early voting will start for the city of Detroit officially on October the 19th. Absentee ballots have already gone out for a lot of people here in the state and across the country. So people are voting around the country, and we're still less than 30 days away from November 5th. So there are opportunities for people to cast their ballot, whether it be absentee or even in early voting. But I want you to talk to voters today about the ballot. This is going to be a longer ballot. There's different ways they can vote on this ballot. Of course, you are on there along with a few of your colleagues. And so I want you to share with them what they can expect, particularly those who have not seen this ballot for the November 5th general election.
Yeah, so what I am encouraging people to do is start with the nonpartisan section of the ballot. So find the nonpartisan section. It could be the front on some. So I know people have been saying go to the back of the ballot or flip over the ballot. In some jurisdictions, it's on the front.
Absolutely.
It's on the back of most, but it's on the front of some.
It was
So look for it. It will have a banner that says nonpartisan section. And the first race in the nonpartisan section is the Michigan Supreme Court. And so this year, there are two separate Supreme Court races. So when I ran in 2022, it was just the best of two. Now there are two separate races because one of my colleagues, another Supreme Court justice, decided to step down and not seek reelection. And so there is an open 8-year slot for his seat. I am on the ballot because I'm running a retention campaign because I was appointed. So whenever a judge or justice is appointed to a seat, they have to run in the next general election to retain that seat, basically, so that Michiganders have a say on whether or not they stay on the ballot. So I am on the ballot, and my term is also a partial 4-year term because you also have to finish out the term of the judge or the justice that vacated the seat. So yes, I will be back here in 2028. But should I be honored to keep my seat? And so there is, again, an 8-year spot. It will say vote one of one. There are only two people in that spot. I'm supporting Kimberly Ann Thomas. And then my seat will be for the partial 4-year term. It will say Justice of the Supreme Court underneath my name. But the key is you have to bubble us in. We are not captured by straight ticket voting. If you want to vote for me or Kimberly or both of us, our votes do not affect each other. So people are saying, I just want to make sure. Two separate races. Vote for the both of us.
right.
It's really easy. Kyra and Kim, nonpartisan section, the two women, just bubble it in. Not captured by straight ticket. But you also have your other local judges. Some people will have a court of appeals race. Some people will have your circuit court, your probate judges, some district court judges, depending upon where you live, and your school boards, right? There are so many jurisdictions that have school board races. All of those are in the nonpartisan section of the ballot and not captured by straight ticket. So even if you go and vote, and even if you're voting for all the partisan positions or you hit straight ticket voting, you are not done. You want to vote the entire ballot because you want to know who's on your school board, right? You want to be able to have a say in that. You want to know who your judges are. And a lot of people say to me, I don't know who to vote for. I don't want to make a mistake. Take a little bit of extra time, Google individuals, go to their website, see if you know who they're endorsed by. Are they organizations that you're familiar with? That's a great way to know because, especially for us in our community and Black people, we are the most justice impacted community. And we are not voting for our judges who are doing a lot of that work. And so it's imperative for our community to not only vote, but also to vote for our judges. And I will say this, in 2022, I lost by 2 percentage points of second place, roughly 200,000 votes across the state of Michigan, which is not, it's not a bunch, right? There was a 1 million vote drop off between the governor's race and the nonpartisan section of the ballot. Not my race, just the governor's race and the nonpartisan section. So that means over 1 million people did not have their voices heard in the Supreme Court race, and it gets worse once you get further down ballot, right? Potentially missing ballot initiatives, potentially missing school board or their local judges. And again, we're the most justice impacted people. And not only is it imperative that we vote, but we deserve to have a voice in those of who's making those very important decisions.
I totally agree with you. And it makes sense, particularly for us. And when I say us, like you said, talking about Black people, it makes a difference when you're in a courtroom and you see a judge that looks like you. When you see someone that is from your community, when you see someone that is a reflection of you, that makes a difference. And you're able to say that I voted for that person, that I took the time to cast my ballot for that individual that is sitting in that seat and maybe making a judgment in my favor or making a judgment about a case that I'm involved in. And so I think that's very important. And for those that, and I like how you mentioned, take a minute and Google justice or not, or Google a candidate that you might have questions about. Because you're saying, I don't know who this person is. Absentee voting gives you the ability to look at your ballot and take out your phone and look up these individuals because you have the time to look them up and become acquainted with who they are as candidates before you make that decision. And you can vote from your own home without any pressure of anyone voting in person, feel like you're under the gun or something like that. You have the privacy, you have the ability to vote in the comfort of your own home, and you're able, it's not cheating, you're not taking a test. So you can look these individuals up and become informed and take that opportunity to make an informed decision about who you're voting for. It's that important. It really is. Full disclosure, I voted already, and I've definitely cast my ballot for my friend, Justice Kyra Harris Bolden, and her colleague. I encourage everyone to do the same. Make sure you go and exercise your right to vote. Guys, I hope you're enjoying my interview with my good friend, Justice Kyra Harris Bolden. She's with us, our special guest on this week's edition of the Thinking Out Loud radio show. We're getting ready to take our first break. When we come back, we're going to jump right back into my interview with Justice Kyra Harris Bolden on the Thinking Out Loud radio show. We'll be right back.